Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
The title of my paper is A Critical Study of Shame and Guilt in Alison McQueen's The Secret Children. The feelings of shame and guilt are evoked when a person is conscious of his or her wrongdoing. The self-consciousness compels one to review his or her identity in society. In terms of Sigmund Freud's psychological interpretation, shame is associated with uncontrolled sexual behavior which causes social disapproval. Guilt is superego anxiety, and it can be described as a reaction against an action which the society considers as bad. In this paper, I have analyzed the association of shame and guilt with race and gender, two important determinants of social identity. I wish to explore how racial prejudices affected the individual lives caught in interracial encounters in colonial India. The study aims to analyze the implications of these racial prejudices for the mixed race progeny resulting from interracial encounters. I have based my study on the textual analysis of Alison McQueen's book, The Secret Children. Now let me tell you a bit about Alison McQueen. Born to an Anglo-Indian mother, Alison McQueen is a British author who lives in the United Kingdom. Her book, The Secret Children, was published in 2012 by Orion. Now, I will tell you the story in brief little bit. The overall critical perspective of my analysis is psychological study of shame and guilt in the characters in McQueen's book. The major characters in this book are James MacDonald, an English tea planter, Cinthymani, his Indian mistress, Dorothy, James's British wife, Seraphina and Mary, who are daughters of James and Cinthymani. Now in this book, Seraphina and Mary are the secret children. The novel is set in Assam, a tea producing state in the northeastern part of India. The time frame of the book ranges from the 1930s to 1950s. In the early 1930s, it was a custom in the remote tea gardens that a white man could take a local woman as his mistress and could live with her as long as he wished to without going through the rites of marriage. These women came mostly from very poor families where daughters were considered as burdens, and any socially recognized arrangement of getting rid of these daughters pleased the parents. Following this custom, through the intervention of an old matchmaker, Cinthymani had become James's concubine. Things became difficult for them when two children, Seraphina and Mary, were born from this relationship. James could neither abandon his responsibility towards his daughters, nor could he acknowledge them socially because that required acknowledging Cinthymani as his wife, which was something he could not think of doing as a member of the colonizer society. In order to connect himself with the normal rhythm of his society, he married Dorothy, a British doctor. Cinthymani was slowly abandoned. Unable to accept her separation from James, she lost her mind. Things became worse when the pillars of colonial rule started to crumble during the 1940s. Flabbergasted by the anti-colonial movements such as Quit India and Bharat Chhoro Andolan, the British government became desperate to check the indisciplined tea planters, whose liaisons had resulted into mixed race progeny. James was fired from his job. After James left the place, Cinthymani's survival was at stake. Beyond the threshold of James's quarters, she was a social outcast, a fallen woman, an outsider in the Indian society. In order to save her life, she took the disguise of a widow. But ultimately what happened to her, she met the fate of an Indian widow who had neither wealth nor a wealthy male protector to take care of her. She lay dead in a small dark room without anybody's knowledge. Seraphina and Mary were sent to convent. Their existence was kept secret from the polite society. After growing up, they became nurses and worked in the cities. Now I would proceed towards the critical appreciation. Now, although this book is a work of fiction, the narrative consists of autobiographical elements. The author acknowledges this fact in the postscript to the book titled as The Story Behind the Secret Children. Here, she shares with the readers that Mary, who has been represented as the younger sister in the novel, is her mother, and Seraphina, who has been represented as the elder sister in the novel, is her aunt. She informs us that she had to pester her mother for finding out the family secret. The purpose of hiding this secret was to conceal the truth of their origin, which in terms of the colonial prejudices of racial identity was looked upon as impure and unsanctified. In the book, the author informs us that among the two girls, Seraphina, the elder sister, was the first one to know the truth about their parents' relationship. The secret had such an effect on her tender mind that she developed a strange habit of hiding herself from others. She sought to erase the secret. She told her sister, quote, "I am going to find myself a wealthy husband and have a wonderful life," unquote. In their childhood, Seraphina warned her sister never to mention the identity of their parents, their tea plantation background and convent to anybody. She tried to convince Mary that they had been sent to the convent in order to hide the stigma of miscegenation. She explained to her sister the vulnerability of not belonging to a particular racial group, and she tells her, again quote, "A halfling is a nobody. No one will ever want you. You will never be accepted anywhere if people know what you are," unquote. Seraphina's words reveal her anxiety of becoming an outcast in the society. She has grown up with the trauma of being born outside wedlock. Her consciousness of being recognized as half-caste and illegitimate in society generated the feeling of shame in her. As far as the Freudian interpretation of anxiety is concerned, her sister as well as she suffered from the intense effect of birth trauma. According to Sigmund Freud, the process of birth generates trauma in the mind of the child because the process metaphorically connotes loss of the protected zone within which the child had found security since the moment of its conception. The process of birth carries with it the apprehensions of encountering the existential threats in the world outside the womb. Through this interpretation, Freud connects the biological concept of birth with the psychological concept of anxiety. Shame and guilt are manifestations of anxiety, which as per Freudian interpretation is triggered by the traumatic experience of birth. The birth of two mixed-breed children in the critical interphase, where anxiety triggered by the feelings of shame and guilt interrogate the social identity of the major characters in this novel. The very truth about her birth reminded Seraphina about the dangers that threatened her position in society. As a child, she perhaps had become anxious about the unknown dangers. At that time, her reactions such as hiding behind the thrashing machine, her introvert nature, her decision to run away from the house were symptomatic of neurotic anxiety. Even Mary, the younger sister, sees nightmares in which the elephants, symbolizing instinctual forces in nature, threaten the peace of her mind. Although it seems that Mary is less sensitive and more practical than her elder sister, the recurring image of elephants in her nightmares indicate the presence of neurotic anxiety in her subconscious mind. In the case of Sinthimani, the anxiety was so intense that it led her to the verge of insanity. When she had accepted her relationship with James, perhaps at that time she had calculated that there was less shame in earning her living as a concubine of a white man than in tolerating the hardships of poverty in a family burdened with the guilt of reproducing 5 daughters. Her aim had been to ensure socio-economic security by providing sexual gratification to her master. So when she realized that her master no longer craved for her body, the ground beneath her feet started to slip away. Her life as well as her identity were at stake in the Indian society. Although she could not become a wife, she had become a mother, but her motherhood was not something to be glorified in the polite circle. Sudden realization of her shameful status in the society made her feel helpless. Out of frustration, she became alcoholic. At times, she pulled her hair, clawed her own flesh, and smashed the utensils in the courtyard. In an article entitled Freud's Teaching on Shame, Paul Alfred Hazard explains that, quote, "The object of neurotic anxiety is unknown because of repression. In order to get rid of anxiety, the ego calls to its aid the defense mechanism of repression, which pushes knowledge of the danger out of consciousness," unquote. Now, Sinthimani's addiction to whiskey can be seen as a repressive measure to erase from her mind the guilt of her shameful existence. Her body could survive the physiological ailments as long as her consciousness lay dead under the inebriating effect of the liquor. She succumbed to the diseases of the mind and the body when there was nobody around to provide her with a draught of wine. While the overtly neurotic Sinthimani had surrendered to wine as a repressive measure, Seraphina had chosen falsehood as a suitable means of assuaging her anxieties. She hid the truth about her genesis from her fiancé. However, through their experiences, both the sisters realized that none of the repressive measures could offer a permanent solution to their anxieties. When Seraphina discovered that she was pregnant before her marriage, she did not disclose this secret to her fiancé. Although she was carrying her fiancé's child, she was afraid of facing the world as a woman who has lost her virginity before her wedding. Perhaps she was apprehensive of going through the harrowing experiences of her mother. Being a convent-educated trained nurse, Seraphina was not as helpless as the illiterate Sinthimani. With her sister, she went to a private clinic in a faraway place for aborting the child. In the clinic, however, Mary could realize the derogatory attitude of the society towards the Anglo-Indian women. When she urged the doctor to be more attentive towards her sister, he reproached her by saying that, quote, "Women like you, with your chutney Mary clothes and loose morals, you think this is how decent women behave," unquote. The doctor's remark shows that in spite of obtaining English education and respectable jobs in India, the Anglo-Indian women could not get rid of the stereotyped images to which they had been subjected down the generations. This was the reason, perhaps, as to why the author's mother and her aunt bore the legacy of shame and guilt in their minds. Mary's faithfulness towards her sister's promise is but a covert manifestation of her acceptance of this legacy. Another very important thing about this novel is that the shame and guilt was not one-sided. Mcqueen'S narrative shows that in the interracial encounter between the British man and the native woman, the society of the colonizers was also affected by shame and guilt. Mixed race sexual union was considered as an anathema in the white society. As per the racial theories of the 19th century, it was believed that miscegenation robbed a white man of his vigor and resulted into racial chaos. This was the reason as to why James MacDonald and his friends could not get officially married to the local women such as Sinthimani, with whom they lived like man and wife under the same roof. Such relationships were considered to be temporary adjustments for fulfilling the sexual needs of white men posted in the remote corners of the empire. Time and again, James is warned against the insidious consequences of his liaison with Sinthimani by his friend Alex. Although his conscience urged him to do the needful towards his mistress and their children, he could not give up the racial prejudices that lay deep within his colonial psyche. On the one hand, fatherhood reminded him of his shameful involvement in miscegenation, and on the other hand, it infused in him the sense of guilt for betraying the trust of two innocent children. He had also realized that his marriage to Dorothy was in a way a betrayal to Sinthimani. He sent the children to convent not only to give them English education but also to hide them from the world that condemned miscegenation. The children were evidence of his breaking the norms of the colonial society to which he belonged. Hazard explains that in neurotic anxiety, the subject fears his own libido. After the birth of Seraphina, James begins to fear his own libido, which gradually distances him from Sinthimani and finally detaches him from her after the birth of the second child. The effect of this anxiety is so intense that he abstains from producing a child with Dorothy. Being his wife, Dorothy accepts his neurotic condition with both empathy and frustration. Seen from the connotative point of view, James's uncontrolled masculinity symbolizes the rashness of the British Empire in India. His anxieties, his shame and guilt represent the shame and guilt of the shattering empire, which was gradually giving in to the pressures of the anti-colonial forces. The fact that the empire itself was suffering from the neurotic anxiety becomes apparent when the head officials in Calcutta decide to control the indiscipline in the tea estate by firing the managers like James. In the late phase of the colonial rule, such a decision was nothing more than a repressive measure to assuage the anxiety of losing her control over her empire. Now I would like to conclude. Mcqueen's text is very interesting not only from the psychological perspective but also from the post-colonial perspective. It should be noted that Mcqueen, the Anglo-Indian writer born and brought up in the United Kingdom, has freed herself from the colonial legacy of shame and guilt. Had it not been so, she would not have come up with this semi-autobiographical work. It is also interesting that she has tried to review her Anglo-Indian identity through a matrilinear narrative. Her open acceptance of her past is an acknowledgement of her Indian lineage. Her story shows that the second generation of the Anglo-Indian diaspora has liberated itself from the racial prejudices of the colonial period. To them, the truth of their genealogy matters more than anything else. Writing from the multicultural space of London, Mcqueen's narrative is an important text that seeks to look beyond the dividing lines of race, color, and gender. Thank you.